Constructed Criticism is brought to you by our three amazing sponsors, Grey Viking Games, Oasis Games, and PureMTGO.com. You can find them directly in the links in the show notes and use the codes associated with each sponsor. We appreciate each of them and definitely think that you should check them out for all your Magic the Gathering needs. Now sit back and enjoy this week's episode of Constructed Criticism.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 378th episode of Constructed Criticism. I am your foretold host, Mason, joined by my co-host, Goldspan Dragon Abe, and Smoldering Egg, co-host Spencer. I was going to say Spencering Egg, and then I forgot the card was called Smoldering Egg, and now we're here and we're thriving.
So how long until I flip?
7 mana, not turns, buddy.
Oh, yeah. Thanks.
that was really funny.
Maybe
behind the scenes.
Maybe
Dude,
next,
that was funny. I was like, man,
next
that card's
episode
way
will
better
be
than I
Alrin's
thought.
Epiphanies, right?
But yeah, after last week's episode, Spencer messaged the group chat, and he's like, my opponent's egg flipped a turn early. And I was like, flipped a turn early? What does that mean? And then Spencer's like, yeah, he cast a spell, and I started dying.
So I didn't think it was turns. I thought it was just every time you cast a spell, it got a counter.
Oh, sure, yeah.
And for some reason, I also thought it was 5 counters. So, like, all kinds of me were wrong on this card.
Card's nice. But it kind of ties into what we're going to talk about today. We're going to be going over all things blue-red. We're going to be talking a lot about blue-red dragons in Standard, but also some other ways to play blue-red that have been popping up. This sort of archetype, as we're going to get into more later in the episode, is really expansive and really wide in a lot of ways. You can do a lot of different things. And if we're going to talk about like a deep dive on one type of deck in Standard, this is the one that covers the most. And I think it's going to help you get a good picture of how these decks are trying to be played, and how you can attack these sort of decks and kind of get a feel for them. So it's going to be a really fun thing when we get to that. But first, we have to do our always improving segment. That is the point of the show. And Abe will kick things off with you. What was your always improving moment this week?
My always improving moment this week was sticking to a lot of my regimen I'd set for myself for how much time I was going to invest into Arena and the Standard format, and also treating myself to a little bit of draft. I've actually, for the first time ever, hit double Mythic on Arena this season. Basically, just hitting the ground running with Midnight Hunt's release, which I said I would do, and I've been really excited to be doing. It's been really fun. Actually playing a lot of blue-red along the way, so it's pretty great that we're doing this episode. But yeah, just like, you know, having a schedule and sticking to it and being like not shy with the amount of hours I want to put in, and knowing how many I want to put in a day or a week, and following through on that is something I have never really actually done for myself. I've kind of more played when I've wanted to, what I've wanted to, like, oh, maybe I'll play some Leagues of Modern or some Cube Draft, or like, you know, just jam whatever. But actually organizing my time and setting it aside, you know, time to consume content, time to actually be playing, has really been showing some sick results, and it's been really good.
That's awesome. I'm glad to hear that. My always improving moment from this past week was really wanting to try and figure out some plans and test these different plans in small chunks. I've done a bad job about the wanting to test specifically Modern going into this. We talked about last week, and then to pivot over to Standard where we get closer to the Invitational. But you know, there was the metagame challenge, that sort of stuff on Arena, and so I wanted to win some packs, some boosties, if you would. And so I tried a bunch of stuff this week and did things like, I'm going to play a bunch of Disdainful Strokes to try and beat some of these bigger blue-red decks and sort of match up, that sort of thing. And it yielded some good results, and I think did a lot to help me kind of understand like where the real weak points of certain decks are, and the best way to pivot, and the way to kind of pivot your deck also around the things that are kind of weak points, you know? Things like the Esper Stadium deck for the current Standard is kind of like a fringe control deck. Seems like that deck would be very weak to a bunch of shatters, but it actually just kind of pivots into kind of being a more of a traditional like Delver deck at a certain point, where it just kind of stakes a threat and protects it. So that sort of stuff was really enlightening and really helpful for me the past week. Spencer, what about you?
Can we actually keep going on yours for a second? Because I really
hit me, baby.
Like something that you just said, and kind of the avenue in which you explained it. Because this is something that I used to be really good at, that I think that I've gotten like too far away from in my deck building. And I noticed that actually because of the metagame challenge this week and adjusting. I played a bunch of metagame challenge with blue red, and then I switched to kind of the deck that I would play in center right now in mono white. But I noticed I had a problem in my mono white deck where I was trying to do too many things. Like if I'm going to play, I'm trying to remember the name of the planeswalker now. The
Bahamut. The one that searches the second hand?
Yeah, if I'm gonna play second hands, like I really wanted to lean in and stuff. And in the first challenge that I played in with mono white, I played a mirror in like round 4 or something, and my opponent had a card that I actually had in my very first build, which is the spirit that makes a flying spirit when you play your second spell. And even though I won the match, that card was like really insane for them. And it was really funny because I thought to myself, like, you used to be a lot better at, like, identifying what your deck was trying to do, Spencer, making sure that your deck did that first, and then adjusting to the metagame. And too often now, I just try to adjust to the metagame first as the first part of my deck building goes. And I really like that you try different packages within the same things to adjust for the metagame rather than building for the metagame.
Yep. Yeah. I think it's important. I don't know. I think you can figure out a lot of really important stuff just by kind of thinking about how the games play out. And often I think that sort of thing will go a long way. Like, I think if you are able to figure out, like, hey, how does the blue-red deck win? And you think about it and you're like, well, they cast Alvern's Epiphany and Goldspan Dragons. Like, well, if I had 3 Disdainful Strokes on my deck, they only have 5 more cards that can beat me. And I have some other cards that stop those cards as well. So I'm going to try doing that sort of thing. And I think sometimes they don't play out as well in practice because they kind of change stuff. But other times it plays out perfectly. And just a little bit of theory crafting and a little bit of applied testing, and you can go a long way and really min-max your time as well, which I think is super important for, the stuff that's coming up. I mean, this is kind of a weird thing we haven't mentioned yet, but like there's like kind of a Grand Prix in Vegas since we recorded our last episode being announced for a month and a half, which I'll be at. And there's like the Star City Games Invitational and those tournaments, which I'll be at as well. So there's a lot of testing and things I got to do and that sort of stuff. And I'm sure there'll be other people there who I hope to see you at the event. But, you can get a lot more done with your testing that sort of way by using your free time where you can't play Magic, thinking about how cards will play out, and then testing those in the time you do have. So
we should do a podcast on applied testing. That is actually like something that I think that would help the listeners a lot. My always improving moment this week was a little bit different. Obviously, like it's funny. I should just use the one on the from the intro, but I wanted to be pretty specific this weekend. What I wrote down was making a mistake earlier in a game doesn't make you less likely to make the right play later. And for some context in this, for me, like it can often take me a long time to like understand a board state. If you are a long-time listener, you heard me talking about how I need to slow down a lot in Magic because I just constantly am playing off of instinct rather than like evaluating. And, if you're a really long-time listener, you know that actually cost me an SCG top 8 against a Thopter Foundry deck when I was playing Sultai in Legacy. And, the other day I made a misplay, like the same misplay 3 times and saw it later. And my first thought was like, I cannot believe that I missed this. I missed this 3 times. But I immediately made the correct play, let it go, and kind of just moved forward. And it actually flipped... It flipped the matchup for me quite a bit, where I was losing with sorry, I was losing with dragons against mono green pretty consistently, and understanding like how kind of how the sequencing should work was pretty big. I should have written down what the play was, but I remember thinking about it and just remembering, like, too often I think that we feel embarrassed for no reason. And I think that the truth is that, like, nobody knows you misplayed. And also nobody really cares other than, like, your opponent when they feel like they got lucky. And just moving forward and, like, making the right play the time that you can make it is just... It's pretty easy and something to remember.
Yeah, I really kind of want to speak on yours as well for a second there, because it reminds me of the famous quote I always say, and people I think I'm joking all the time, but it's true, and it's from the inspirational, iconic Hannah Montana of "Everybody makes mistakes, everybody has those days," and the line is like, it's kind of funny and it's a little lighthearted, but it is serious, right? Like it's just the truth. Like everybody makes mistakes, everybody makes misplays in these games. And you cannot let those tear you down, especially when you're in game. I was talking to a friend about this just yesterday, actually, where I was like, yeah, I hate myself from years ago in tournaments where I made mistakes, but I don't let that affect me in the game. I let that motivate me to do better and to push me forward. And just because you lost, it's the same logic as like, well, if you lost the last round of the tournament, it doesn't mean you're going to lose the next round, right? Like those things are independent of each other. Just like you made the wrong play last time, it does not mean you'll make the wrong play again. Right. And so, I think it's good that you recognize that.
One of the things to kind of think about that on that, like there was kind of this meme a few years ago. I think Magic players have gotten better at it, where like being self-deprecating was like a pretty big thing that we did as like competitive Magic players, and we've
still do.
It's fair. I think that
we haven't had tournaments in 2 years.
Yeah,
that's what happened.
There's the for those who know, the best Smash Brothers player in the world. His name is he goes by MK Leo, and I was watching one of his videos this week, and he like one of the things that he said was, if you gave it, if you watched your own matches, what would you think? And he said, I would think that guy sucked. I was like, come on. Like, you would see your mistakes because you're great, not because you suck, because you obviously don't suck. You're like actually the greatest player in the world. And I think about all of the conversations that I've had with Paulo, where Paulo's pretty hard on himself. Seth is really hard on himself. I mean, even on this podcast, you guys have heard Seth be hard on themselves. And I think that being hard on yourself is like, okay, but at some point you got to be like, okay, I saw the right line. Like, have a positive mindset about the fact that you got there, not a negative mindset that you missed it.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. In the like limited amount of coaching I've done with people, like usually players local to me or people who I know, there's always one story that I bring up, because a common thing that a lot of players do is when they notice that they've made a mistake, their whole world falls apart, right? Like they know that now things aren't as good as they could have been, and now they're really worried about it. But there was a PPTQ that I won, like it was like the first couple weeks of Con Standard.
Sick brags, Abe.
Where,
Sick brags.
Yeah, I won a PPTQ back in 2015, man. It was a wild time.
I know you did. You brought it up just seconds ago. Please.
And this misplay I made was that I'd like cast. I had a Soulfire Grandmaster in play, and my opponent's playing mono red, and they've attacked with their 1-drop. So I'm thinking, do I attack with my Soulfire Grandmaster, or am I leaving it back to block? And I think about this for like 35 seconds. I need to make sure I get it right. It's a pretty big decision. And then I go, okay, I can attack. I should attack. And I attack. And then I look at my hand and I just have a Manus Rider. And I'm like, wow, I wish I would have cast that before combat. But as soon as you notice those mistakes, you just have to like be like, okay, this is the game I'm playing now. I'm in my post-combat main phase with a Manus Rider in my hand. Is it still better to cast this Manus Rider or do something else? And I just kept going with it and cast my Manus Rider post-combat. Embarrassingly, was like, yeah, well, you make mistakes. And I proceeded to like, win that game, win the tournament. It's a great teaching moment for that kind of thing, because there's nothing that one independent misplay or one independent thing doesn't stop you from performing well and doing well in the tournament, and I just think it's like a really important thing to remember all the time when you play, is like identifying where the mistake came from is really important, and like giving yourself reinforcements to make sure you don't do it again is important, but it doesn't have to be like the end of the world.
Dude, you just made me so happy. We did an entire episode on this like years ago called "Don't Compound Mistakes." Like, don't make your mistake worth a mistake later. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, sunken cost fallacy is real. I would love to do an episode one day on, and this might need to be like a thing where we talk about doing grab bag episodes. We talk about a lot of little topics in one, but I think this is one that we should really do one on, where it should be part of that at least, where it's Magic players realizing the difference between a mistake and a hard decision, because I think too often those things get conflated in Magic players' minds. And I think very often the mistake is something like what Abe did, right? Where it's like,
Yeah.
You have a Mantis Rider. It's the only thing you can cast. It has haste and you're about to attack. That's a mistake.
Right.
That's fine. But if you're expressive iterationing on turn 3 or whatever, right, and there's like a bunch of different options that are all really good, there's a lot of different ways the game can play out. There's a lot of different variable points. And there might be an optimal play, but it isn't a guaranteed mistake. And I watched this happen this past weekend, actually. I played a Legacy tournament locally, and I was watching my friend play, and he went land DRC bobble, right? And then he like surveilled off his DRC, and he left the card on top. Or he'd been, it doesn't even really matter. And then he popped the bobble, and he thought for a second about who he should look at. And he was just like, I'll look at myself, right? And it's like, well, you should look at your opponent's deck. You're going to draw that card no matter what, and you have no spells left to do. You just lose information. And that's a mistake, right? And later on in the game, he cast Expressive Iteration and like took a line that maybe wasn't the most optimal or was a little high risk. And at the end of the match, I was like, do you want to talk about your mistake? And he was like, yeah, I should have expressed it this way. And I was like, no. On turn 1, you bobbled the wrong person, so you didn't know. Like, if you knew he has a force in hand or like something along those lines, that could be really helpful to know. So I think we should do an episode or something like that on that, because I think those are actual mistakes.
I missed the always improving segment, man. This was just a great conversation, Mason. Thank you.
No problem. Thank y'all. All right. We've done that. We've wrapped it up. You know how it be. Let's move on to our main topic today for the training grounds. And we're talking about the blue-red kind of colors in standard. To be honest, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about Goldspan Dragon. Kind of the blue-red dragon deck might be a way to look at this. But we're going to cover things that aren't just Goldspan decks. So don't worry, it's not going to be all talking about the all-powerful Goldspan Arena today. Let's probably start off with that one, though, because I think that is the version that people think about the most. When you talk about blue-red decks, I think Goldspan Dragon's Alrund Epiphany really pops out to players. And there's a couple ways you can do that with playing cards like Smoldering Egg or not playing Smoldering Egg and playing less creatures. And Abe, what do you think about, let's start with specifically the egg version of these Goldspan decks. Do you think these are stronger decks than others? Do you think that, like, what is like the appeal to be playing this sort of deck over the other type of blue-red stuff?
So I think right now, if I had to like pick what the strongest cards in blue were and red were, like the two that come to mind are reds is Goldspan Dragon and blues is Alrund's Epiphany, and especially Alrund's Epiphany in conjunction with having like a board presence is just one of the best ways to go over the top of the rest of the format. There's a lot of like a lot of the Essex Chariot small ball stuff can be really invalidated by just taking a couple turns in a row and swinging the tide very suddenly. The amount of mana you get access to and the amount of advantage you get access to from Alrund's Epiphany is huge. The tokens are very good. If you have multiples, the game can really snowball out of control. And Goldspan Dragon makes it so that casting a 7-mana spell is really, really accessible. These kind of blue-red egg versions are, I think, right now the most popular blue-red decks. The Smoldering Egg is a really good thing to be able to like have a board presence when you cast Epiphany. Previously in the old standard format, you had adventure creatures like Brazen Borrower or Bone Crusher Giant that you kind of had lying around, and they're pretty cheap to deploy, so that when you finally got to the stage game you're Alrund's Epiphanying, you would have this presence to close the game with without necessarily needing to have a dragon or like an activatable Faceless Haven or something. But this card does that job very well. My biggest issue, I think, with the decks right now is that Smoldering Egg is it's too fragile and too vulnerable a card. So personally, I've been playing a lot of dragons builds that have
Go ahead.
Builds that just have different threat suites that are a lot slower, and playing more to control the game until I can safely develop a Goldspan Dragon or resolve an Epiphany, and then a dragon or like an Immorth or a Moonveil Regent. Really just trying to change the role I'm playing rather than being one of like a combo deck where I'm like going to go off the turn I cast Epiphany to maneuvering the game to a point where my Epiphanies can win me the game. And really there's a lot of different ways the deck's being built right now, but overall the reason that this deck is so powerful is just that Epiphany is one of the strongest cards in the format, and Goldspan Dragon is easily the biggest mana engine in the format, as well as one of the best things to pair with extra turns.
Before we move on, because I do want to talk about what you were talking about there, Spencer, because I heard you started to say something I was curious about myself. I think there's one more thing that Abe kind of alluded to. He mentioned specifically to the strongest blue and the strongest red card, but I think the biggest pull and thing you'll see in every one of these Izzet decks we talk about is expressive iteration. I think that's a very important card to keep in mind. I'm talking about all these blue-red decks. It is the card that gives these blue-red this mid-game to late-game draw that pulls them so far ahead and allows them to see so many more cards and enable these game plans. And that card is really being a big, kind of the third point in the triangle of power for Izzet. So I did want to mention that because every deck we will talk about today plays 3 to 4 expressive iterations, rightfully so. Spencer, what are you going to talk about when it comes to the Egg versus Moonveil Regent, Amaranth type stuff?
Well, the thing that stood out to me in what Abe said is kind of similar to what I wanted to say about the Egg. So the version I played the most did have Egg. So the first thing I did is I played the version that Abe got Mythic with. The second thing I did is kind of adjust Abe's deck for how I was playing into the metagame. Like for me, I think I'm either in... Man, I don't remember. I'm either in like Diamond 2 or Plat 2. I'm in one of the two. And so for me, like I was playing against a lot of mono white and a lot of mono green. And weirdly, and obviously a lot of werewolves. Werewolves is kind of everywhere. And so, like, against certain decks, like mono white and werewolves, the Egg's really good. Against mono green, it's really bad. Like, almost all of the creatures are going to end up with 4 power, like, in like 2 seconds. And I actually think the reason that people have moved further away from, like, straight Gruul and have diverged into a Jund and mono green decks is actually because of level 0 Egg, because it slows the game down enough that you then have to either attack through it or like just be a different deck, right? Like the Jund deck at this point is like, you know, playing like Valky and like it's just actually straight up a Jund deck now, which is interesting. I think that I don't know that it's fragile. I think that it's getting cross hate from the fact that like all of the best creatures, whether it's Moonveil Regent in the Jund decks or these decks, whether it's Goldspan Dragon in the Jund decks or these decks, or you know all of these things. Like we talked about 4 toughness for like multiple minutes last week, right? And now this card's getting that hate. So I don't know that it's fragile. I think the format is adjusting to the things above it. But the other thing I did want to mention is, like, I have literally never lost a game with an Ashmouth Dragon in play, and I also have never beaten an Ashmouth Dragon once it's flipped. So, I don't know if it's like a win more card, or if it is dependent on the deck you're playing, but I don't know that it's fragile as much as, like, it, you know, 4 toughness is just, like, a thing people are trying to deal with.
Yeah, I think when I describe it as fragile, I'm probably even... like projecting a little bit of my like play bias into it, where there's a lot of really good things about the card, like having a 2-mana play so that you can follow up with an expressive iteration on turn 3 is really big. Like my build that I hit Mythic with, I built specifically to be able to foretell on 2 a lot of the time, because you need to... Your expressive iterations are your best cheap spells outside of your like Dragon's Fires, and so... But you want to cast them on turn 3, so you need to have something to do on turn 2 with your mana, and Smoldering Egg does that. But I think that the fact that it's so often exposed and you want to get it out means that because I was playing the games in such a controlling way, and the way I'd built my deck was the way it was, that maybe I might be projecting that the card was not as protectable in the early game onto it, but it could be really good.
You know, one of the things, though, you just made me think of is it does have... I don't know how much of the Smoldering Egg you played, Mason, but, like, it does actually have awkward play patterns specifically against werewolves. So, like, in the early turns, it's really good, right? Because it's a spell you can play. But then you're forced into, like, your counterspells being bad because you want to leave up counterspells or Prismari Command against werewolves, and then their werewolves flip, and, like, the 2/3 that gives haste, like, if that thing flips against this card, like, this card is just dead. Like, it doesn't even matter anymore.
Yeah, this is funny. We'll get into this here in a little bit when we get off the gold space, off the the dragon, like the really dragony builds. But I've been like playing a lot of not this kind of blue red, and I've played a good amount of the deck that like Abe hit Mythic with and little tweaks to it. But I remember talking to Abe, and I was like, I do not like what the Egg was doing to the deck at the moment, because it was making you kind of play a lot of 3s and a lot of 4s. So that you can consistently flip the Egg. Because the kind of play pattern was you slam it on 2 as a blocker, and you would like to flip it by turn 5, so you can start controlling the board a little bit. Or you want to play it in Alrons in the same turn, right? Like kind of play it, maybe protect it for a turn, then Alrons and start smacking them, blowing them up. Which is...
I actually have a version of this deck that I haven't tried yet. that does not play Epiphany and is actually a Delver Egg deck instead.
Yeah, you should try playing the deck I posted to Card Kingdom. I think you would really like that. It avoids the egg, but you play a lot of similar cards, and you play Hermit in the main deck. So
I do like Hermit. That's a card I'm excited to talk about.
Yeah, the Hermit's really, really good. Spoilers. But I think one of the things that the egg does, and Spencer kind of mentioned this, or maybe it was Abe. Sorry to get you confused there. But you were like how the egg is good at blocking its mono white early, and it transforms and it starts shooting down the mono white creatures and kills them really quick, right? But against green, it's really bad because obviously their stuff attacks through you. It also compounds in other ways in that matchup where your Dragon's Fires or a Draconic Roar, whatever it is, the one that you reveal a dragon. By not having a Moonveil Regent or an Imranth, you actually can't kill things like the Old Troll as consistently because now you only have Goldspan in your deck. You have to actually flip the egg before you can start killing those things by choosing that as a dragon. So there are other ways in which this kind of card, I think, is really metagame dependent, and kind of the way you build your blue-red dragons deck. I think the suite of dragons that you play as your supporting cast, or your threats, maybe I should say, are much more important about the type of things that you're going to be dealing against. So like Abe having Moonveil Regent in his deck, right, allows him to really shoot down the trolls and stuff like that and have a much stronger game against these sort of chunky beatdown decks that maybe the egg doesn't quite really interact with as well, and is kind of a lot weaker too when you build your deck in that sort of manner. So I think there's a lot of merit to both builds.
Yeah, I actually, for what it's worth, I posted the build that I was playing the most on Twitter. I think that you'd be crazy not to play Moonveil Regent even if you're playing egg. And also, I know that Abe's build that he got Mythic with didn't have this, but one of the first things I did is add the 5-mana 5/5 dragon with Ward 4 as at least a 1-of in my deck. I've had it as a 1-of.
Yeah, that's Imrith. My current build is actually playing 2 Moonveil Regents and 1 Imrith. And I'm thinking even of trying out 3. It's been very impressive.
I think that card's pretty insane. And regardless of whether or not you're playing egg, I do believe that you should be playing some combination of those 2 dragons.
Sure, that's fair. I think to kind of round things up here on the dragon, the really dragon heavy side of stuff, I think these decks are leaning too much on the permission side of things with Divide by Zero and Saw It coming. And I think that's sort of one of the advantages. It's one of the advantages and disadvantages of Abe's deck, right? Like Abe's deck's setting up a Saw It coming on 2 a lot, like you mentioned, you're foretelling a bunch, right? And then you're sticking these Moonveil Regents and you're kind of delvering people. But I think this really makes you get pretty exploitable in the metagame, because Divide by Zero is very strong. We're going to talk about it here in a little bit when we talk about key cards in the deck. That's just a very powerful answer to a lot of things that are going on. It's kind of like a bad Aether Gust or a bad Remand might be a way to look at it. But still, a bad version of those cards are great. And this makes you really weak to things like mono white, I think. And so I think you need to be very cognitive of what the people in the metagame are doing, where the trends are going, and you just have to adjust your blue-red dragon deck to what's going on there. Because if people start playing a bunch of mono white because they're like, yeah, you're playing a bunch of Saw It Comings Divide by Zeros, you're spending 3 mana for my 1 mana spells, you're not going to win those interactions ever. And so you're going to need something like Smoldering Egg to actually let you catch up when you're spending more mana like that, so your cards have a little extra oomph to them. Let's talk really quick about the snow versions of blue-red, because these are very similar to the dragon versions a lot of the time. And we mentioned this a little bit on last week's episode, but the snow versions are kind of, they are typically like the blue-red dragon deck, but they have Frostbite and Faceless Haven as some extra cards they're leaning towards, and they lean on the snow lands a little bit in order to have that extra oomph. But mana's a little clunkier at times. Having a tapped blue-red snow land has that, as well as having colorless lands in the form of Faceless Haven. Spencer, last week on the episode, you were saying maybe we should just cut snow. What do you think now, a week later, after kind of beginning to play it more and knowing we're going to do this episode?
I played a bunch. I believe that there is not... So here's the thing. I do actually think that Frostbite is a little bit better than I thought it was.
Mm-hmm.
As of a week later. I don't know that it's worth it, though. The thing is just let's say that I wanted to play Frostbite. Why am I playing Frostbite? It's because I want 1 mana spells, right? Well, if I want 1 mana spells, and I want to interact earlier, and I want to do things with my mana earlier, there's not really a reason to play Snow in my mind, because I would rather just play a Delver version with the whatever the opt equivalent is, and the shock.
Consider.
Yeah, consider.
Play with fire.
Yeah, and play with fire. I think that if I want to do things with my mana earlier, there are better ways to do it. And also, it doesn't even help with the snow, because I'm kind of forced into playing more tap lands. I'm kind of forced into I don't know. I think that the benefits to snow are not good enough for me to want to do the snow stuff.
So here's my hot take. I've told any of y'all this. I've been sitting on this like a smoldering egg, ready to hatch it for y'all. I kind of want to try playing blue-red, but with snow basics as my only snow stuff and a couple of frosty bites in the board, so that when I'm playing like Abe's deck where I'm a little weaker to mono white, I can kind of pivot in, have those frost bites, get some early shocks, and then they scale a little bit later in the game. Where like the mono white deck sometimes reaches 3 toughness.
You just like
so have a little bit more early
like don't play Face the Savings. Your basics are just snow basics. Sometimes you hit 3 basics.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that is a reasonable take.
I don't know if that's good or not, but it was something I was thinking about.
I thought about doing something similar, but I think my biggest issue with that plan is that, especially with how good Divide by Zero has been, and how much it's become like a rising presence in the metagame, and how much that card taxes your sideboard slots. Because you don't want to play. I mean, if you're playing 4 Divide by Zero, you can probably go with playing 3 lessons. You're probably not going to cast all 4 in a game, but you want to have at least 3 and have a good set of coverage with your lessons in your board. But you already have like Burning Hands, which is a necessity because of like Ren and 7 and Essex's Chariot. And there's not really much more room to be bringing in. Like I'm already bringing those in against mono white. I'm not sure that there's really room to be like playing the additional shock effects without making room somewhere else in the list, which I haven't really thought about. But like I had a similar thought before, but after playing a bit with it, I'm not sure.
Yeah, my guess would be that if you're playing the deck I'm talking about, we've concluded Divide by Zero is not where we want to be as heavily because we think mono white's a real player.
Yeah,
and I think if that's the case, we could probably get away with trimming a little on Divide by Zero. So I don't know. That's something that's probably like a bigger talk, but I think as we're gonna get to as we talk about all these blue-red versions, blue-red is very deep and very underexplored, I think, relative to how much people are actually playing it, which is a bunch. People are playing blue-red a lot. It put up like 5 different builds in the top 16 of the Sunday Standard Challenge. So like it's a lot of different builds, especially for a standard format that's so healthy and so diverse. It's kind of sick there.
Also, can we just like shout out the learn mechanic really quick that like everybody was like dunking on for a year? They're like, this is the dumbest mechanic, like it'll never see standard play. And like now there's like black-white learn decks, there's like green-white learn decks, like there's so many.
Not only that, I'll just say this: play 2 environmental scientists in your sideboard. It's like the one you always need. That's all I'm saying.
I
see everyone.
I agree.
You gotta get some science in your life. I don't know. Anyways,
that's a lesson to live by. But that was such a good pun.
It was. But yeah, Abe, do you have any strong feelings on snow, or should I move on? Do you think we kind of covered?
No, I think that, the snow build is always going to, like, the biggest draw to snow is Frostbite, and when Frostbite's good, if you have a bunch of mono white in your local metagame, a lot of mono green in your local metagame, you need to answer those things. Definitely look at snow, but I think right now with so much of the format being about Essex's Chariot and Goldspan Dragon, as we were talking about last week, 4 is the big number and 3 is just not quite there.
I actually think the problem for blue-red is that Faithless Haven is actually just like kind of a cost instead of a benefit to snow in this deck, whereas like I can just play manlands that make colored mana for me. So like what am I actually, I'm just getting Frostbite at that point, whereas like if I play another snow deck, I'm getting Faithless Haven, and that's like why mono green is like, yeah, we're playing snow basics.
Yeah, that's a good point. Let's actually talk about some of those decks that get to do that, and they get to play things like Hall of the Storm Giant, Den of the Bugbear, and that's like the Delver versions of blue-red. And so when we talk about these Delver versions, we are going to talk about some decks that don't include Delver, and make sure to let you know, but let's start with the actual bread and butter Delver decks. On our set review episode, so I'd be very surprised if Delver was good in Standard. After having played against Delver a bunch in Standard, feel incredibly validated, and I think about how smart and handsome I am all the time now. I am not impressed by these Delver actual builds of the deck, especially like shout out to Zan, friend of the show. Zan's got like 12 basics in this, like 12 lands that produce mana, and the rest are double lands. And he has 20 like 5 mana sources. And Zan's like flipping his Delvers really consistently, and he's even moved away from the blue-red builds. And so I have not been hyper impressed by actual Delver in these decks, but I have been hyper impressed by Delver-like game plans. Before we move on to Delver-like game plans, how do you two feel about the actual Delver? And we'll start with you, Spencer, because I know you're a boomer. You know, you love Delver.
Oh man, I don't know if that's true about me, but here's the thing, is that I think people are expecting Delver games out of Delver, like blue-white Delver games out of these Delver decks, and that is not what these Delver decks offer. I think that if you want to play Delver in your blue-red deck, it is because you want to use your mana early. And if you believe that the format is about using all of your mana every turn, I do believe that Delver is a good option to make that happen.
Okay.
I think that, like, I've played a lot against the mono blue Snow Delver deck, and like that deck, like, I'm like, that's a bad Delver. Like, the thing is that a Delver itself, if you play, like, obviously I just talked about how I don't have Elrond's Epiphany in my deck, but actually quite a few of my losses were to non-Snow Delver decks that, like, played Delver plus the 2 1-mana cards that we talked about, the Play with Fires and the Consideration. Is that what it's called?
Mm-hmm.
And the thing is like, Delver wasn't that great, but like the second you have a Delver in play and you play an Elrond's Epiphany, you're like, oh, okay, well, now I'm just as dead as before. The problem is that the problem with Delver in these decks, and the reason that I was so hesitant to do it, is that you end up in this spot where, like, you're playing this 1-mana card that you want to tempo your opponent out with, and then which is why I was moving away from Elrond's Epiphany, because, like, playing a 7-drop and a 1-mana creature in the same deck with a deck that I cannot play less than, like, I don't know, how many mana sources can you play? Like, the 2-mana Force Spike that is a land, great with Delver. Honestly, it's just great in Standard. But is it Joswari's Disruption, I think is the name of the card?
Yeah.
Yep. Nailed it.
The problem is, even with that and the red flip land, the Shadow Skull Smashing or whatever, I don't know. It's hard for me to understand, like, is that just better than Smoldering Egg in the format? Is that just better than playing blue-red control? Like, I think the format needs to, and I said this on the set review, I think it has to be about how you're using your mana, not anything else. And I don't know where we're at right now.
That's fair. Abe, do you have any real thoughts on the Delver in the deck?
Yeah, I mean, as a true paper boomer with a love of Delver Secrets, these are the Delver Secrets. For the YouTubers out there, the YouTube listeners, these are the Delver Secrets I played in the blue-white Delver deck in Standard when I was in high school.
If you pull out a Rune Chatter's Pike right now, I'll Venmo you $10.
It's not here. These are actually the ones I play in Legacy.
Oh.
But
I have 4
real quick. Mason?
Oh, sorry. The time's caught up to you, Abraham.
I haven't played Legacy in a long time. This is the last Legacy deck I played. But yeah, like Delver Secrets has always been a means to an end, right? The best thing about Delver Secrets is that it's such a cheap deployable threat, and the rest of your interaction can do everything else after you've paid only 1 mana for such an efficient creature. And right now, the best sets of interaction don't really lie in blue-red. I do think there were some really impressive things in the blue-red deck. The list that I saw, because I'm a huge Zan fan. Zan and I have a huge amount of history. I love his stream. Even if sometimes I disagree with the decks he plays. But I've watched his journey go from blue-red Delver to all the way to Dimir Delver. And one of the big things that impressed me the most in the blue-red Delver decks was Lear, actually, as a top-end card, because you played a lot of counter magic, but you also played a lot of the cheap red spot removal and burn spells that made Lear really appealing, and also specifically Divide by Zero, not actually countering spells, but generating a big tempo advantage, meant that you could have something to stick like behind your Lear to protect it. And so there's like a lot of good things you can do in the smaller, like, tempo-y shell where your top end isn't so big. but the real problem is that the interactive spells aren't good enough to back up what Delver wants to be doing in red right now. So the blue-red Delver deck, I think is just not quite there. And the card Delver of Secrets is just also not quite there. There's just a lot of good answers to it.
It's funny because like in my head, like in the set review, I imagine blue-red Delver a lot different than what's currently happening. Maybe I'll try and build that, but like I don't think blue-red Delver Dragons, I don't think that's where the deck needs to be. And I think that it's a lot closer to like the red 2/2 with haste that with I want to say kicker, but that's not. There's not actually a name.
Bloodthirsty Adversary.
Yeah, the Adversary.
I think that's closer to what this deck would need to be. And the truth is that because the format is predicated on 4 toughness, unless somehow that like Scry 1 unsummon is good, that you're just not going to see blue-red Delver.
Yeah, Unsummon and Shock have to be good for the blue-red Delver deck to be good. Yeah. And right now, I just don't think those cards are necessarily worth it. But
also the card's getting incidentally blocked in like the part where it's supposed to be closing the game out. There's like a bunch of Moonveil Regents, Aaron's Epiphany, 2 birds stop it, Ren 7 tokens stop it. There's just like a lot of things are actually stopping.
Ren 7, super wrong about that card. I thought that the people were like overreacting that card. Card's really good.
Yeah, card's great. But let's move on to Chariot. Yeah, so the Chariot builds. This is what I really want to talk about. I call it this because I built this kind of deck to really prey on like what people are doing with like 4 toughness, that sort of thing. And I think the Delvery type game plan of having cheap answers with cheap threats and riding them to victory is actually quite strong. So I have explored this in a completely different avenue where the creatures I'm playing instead of playing Delver of Secrets are Malevolent Hermit, which is the disturbed creature that you can spend a blue and sack it to counter something that's a non-creature spell unless they pay 3. This is incredibly powerful. Everyone kind of talked about going on. In the format when it comes to these like Ren and 7s, Chariots, Alrund's Epiphanies, it's really taxing on them. And it's actually great against aggro decks, by the way. Like, it's not the best thing in the world, but in the early games against a white deck, it trades for 2 of their bodies pretty easily. And then the other big one is Suspicious Stowaway, which is the 1/1 unblockable that loots when it hits, that transforms into a werewolf, where on the back half it draws when it hits. And I've kind of built my whole deck around playing the Stowaway with a Hermit early and leaving mana up. And then interacting with what our opponent's doing and kind of crossing the finish line in the later game with 4 Goldspan Dragons, having a couple Aaron's Epiphanies as a way to go over those other decks once we've kind of answered a lot of what they're doing. And I think things like Fading Hope, which is an unsummon we kind of talked about, like if Delver's going to be good and that sort of thing, you need Fading Hopes to be actually good. And I kind of think they are good right now. I think Fading Hope specifically is really good at cleanly answering a Ren and 7. A lot of the times they'll play Ren and the default game plan is to minus and make a token. It's the strongest way to impact the board. And really, you kind of need that to protect your Ren and 7 unless you're super far ahead. I think Fading Hope is really, really good in that sort of spot. I think it's really good against the Blue-Red Dragon deck too, especially things like Moonveil Regent that a lot of their power comes from being stuck on the board and being a presence. I think that sort of stuff goes across there. So I think things like that, I think cards like Demon Bolt are a little inbred for what's going on, but it's the Foretell deal for. I think things like that need to be really explored and looked into. And that's basically the whole deck.
Have you tried a couple, like splitting your Burning Hands, like a couple main, a couple side?
I thought about that. I kind of thought Demon Bolt is a little better in the deck simply because for Suspicious Stowaway, you really don't want to cast anything on turn 3, right? Like you want to play it. Yeah, you also want to use your mana. And so Demon Bolt, one of the cool things about it compared to a card like Saw It Coming is Saw It Coming costs 4 mana if you what's it called? Foretell it, because it's 2 on the back, 2 on the front. Demon Bolt is always 3 mana. It really just depends on when you get to cast it. So I found I could suspend a Demon Bolt, put it in the Foretell zone, I should say. And then if they don't do anything I need to answer with, it's fine. It sits there for later. And so I have, not had that huge of problems actually with things like Mono Green, because I've also built my sideboard to kind of pivot into more of a blue-red control deck. And I play like a bunch of burn down the houses and stuff like that, as that's like my answer to green in combination with Burning Hands. So I think that the Delver type game plan is actually really good. You just need to be a little bit bigger in your Delver thing and be less about permission and more about answers in the format. And I think that's kind of the way to be building these sort of blue-red decks. I'm curious what you two think about this. I know Abe has his, I've talked to Abe about this deck since I've played it, from last week. before we recorded the podcast. And what do y'all think about this sort of approach to doing things? And I see Goldspan Dragon is $60 on Moto.
I'm jealous of Abe. I can tell who your favorite co-host is.
He was the one who was talking to me about Blue Red. He said we can play Blue
Not
Red.
only did I play it, I made fun of him for building it. So
yeah. Abe hates the deck. Abe thinks he called it inbred Blue Red.
At what point in the format are you just reacting, and at what point are you inbred? I don't know. I think I like a lot of what you're saying. A little both, is that what you said?
Yeah, that's a little inbred.
I think that, like, while I actually do agree that, like, Demon Bolt is maybe, like, a little bit inbred for the format, I don't know that that's a problem. Like, that's just where the format might be right now. You really made me want to build it with... So one of the things that I've been thinking about recently, and what you just made me think about, is actually Ray of Frost, I think is the name of the card. It's the 2-mana enchantment that, like, taps down a red creature forever.
I had that in the first build of it, yeah.
And one of the things is like, it doesn't flip Delver, so it just, like, if you're going to play, like, this version of the deck with, like, Delvers, it's just, like, you can't play it. I don't know. I think that Blue-Red is, like, a little bit deeper than I would have ever expected it going into this format. And I don't know if that's, like, the format is small, but Hermit, for what it's worth, has been maybe the best card in both my sideboard and, like, any time that it's in play. And I also have played against the 1/1 you were talking about quite a few times, and the card has also been insane. So I don't know if, like... I don't even know if this deck needs to be blue-red. Like, I think it could be any color combination. You're, like, playing these really cheap threats. Man, you just made me want to put the vampire in these decks and just go ham.
Yeah, I think the reason I really like Blue-Red is, and I mentioned this earlier, and this might just be a thing where it's like sometimes in the podcast, when you're guiding the ship or whatever as the host, things will get brought up later, and they don't get said in the moment, but, like, I'm really big on Expressive Iteration. I think it is one of the most messed up Magic cards since the Throne of Eldraine era. It's not broken like Oko or anything like that, but this card provides an insane amount of selection and card advantage when you have, like, 5 lands to use it with. So I really wanted to build a deck that emphasizes that sort of oomph in the late game and having cheap threats and cheap answers outside of course, you know, the couple Goldspan Dragons. I think it's really important.
It's actually crazy how good that card is. Like, we talked about that on Mythic Cast when I was on there, and it is somehow both your best top deck and your best mid-game play, like, 80% of the time. And that is a weird place for a card to be.
Yeah, there's a reason it is a big player in every format in Magic right now. It's because it is one of the best cards printed in the last couple of years, bar none. But I think that's going to kind of do that on the Delvery versions. I don't have that much I want to say. Abe, did you have anything you really wanted to add that Spencer and I didn't mention when it comes to these sort of Demon Bolty decks? I know you did try them.
So I did try them, and, like, I thought they were actually really good at solving the problem they set out to solve. I called them, like, inbred or whatever, and I, like, memed on it a bit when we were talking about
but
them.
They're good inbred.
but they were successful in what they set out to do, which is, like...
Let me tell you a story about Runechanter's Pike, Abe.
So they're successful in what they set out to do, right? That was a deck that was built to specifically attack a metagame that was full of Esika's Chariot. That was the most played card, and that was the archetype you were seeing the most. And that deck was not going to lose an Esika's Chariot deck. What I took away from it, though, was that it was not also holding up against the other decks in the format, which I was looking to kind of build a more complete version. But the biggest thing I learned from it was just how good the blue 2-drops were. Like, the Hermit, I could not imagine registering less than 3 copies in any of my blue decks, because it's just so good against every deck in the format right now. Body is not trivial. The backside of it, allowing you to, like, force through the Alrund's Epiphanies in your deck, comes up all the time for me. And in so many of the blue mirrors, you know, it's about test of talents or, like, having, like, positioning your counter magic. And this just totally blanks all of your opponent's counter magic on everything except for your creature threats, while also defending you from any amount of planeswalkers they're trying to deploy, any of their own epiphanies. It can help in counter wars. It's kind of like mystical dispute, like face up on the table as soon as you cast it. And so, like, if I hadn't played with that deck, I would not have understood exactly how good those cards were. And I think that the more that people have played with them, as you see on the Moto results for the blue-red decks, I think all of them were playing at least one copy.
I actually remember when Azure Mage was previewed, and like this card is everything we wanted Azure Mage to be times, like, no exaggeration, like at least times 10. Like it does exactly what you want in all of the matchups that you wanted Azure Mage in, yet is better at every facet of the game.
I'm going to say this before we move on. Suspicious Stowaway and like the blue hardcore control decks we're about to talk about here in 1 second, I'm going to segue us to. That, I think, has that plus Hermit, I think, is like an actual plan to beat people, and no one's done it yet, and all of them have these really weird sideboard plans to like kind of pivot on people. I don't quite get it. But let's talk about that really quick. Let's talk about these blue-red decks that are trying to not really play Goldspan Dragon, because I mean every deck we've talked about so far plays Goldspan Dragon, and they're not really trying to play creatures, and they're sort of trying to control the game, get to an Aileron's Epiphany, and then copy it, kind of time stretch and take over the game. What do we think about those decks, Abe? Have you got to explore those?
So I haven't explored the ones without Dragon, but I did notice the potential for a deck like this when I was building the deck that I hit Mythic with. And I actually ended up playing a copy of, I think it's called Galvanic Iteration, the second best iteration in Standard behind Expressive. And that card with Aileron's Epiphany is just a 2-card combo that lets you take 2 extra turns, or you can use it to like kind of beat the counter magic floating around in the format by saying, I'm just going to cast 2 of this spell and overload that. Especially powerful is the fact that the iteration itself has flashback, and so like during the time stretch, if you find another Epiphany, you can just do it again, and it's not even that much more mana. I think my biggest reservation about it is actually that I'm not sure that the pure control game plan of I'm just going to win by epiphanying a bunch with these iterations is something you couldn't incorporate as a piece of your plan in the Dragons deck. So I think there's enough wiggle room in the slots available for Dragons to, if the control matchups are really popular, you can play an iteration or two and have access to that over the course of a long game, find your 1 copy, then start fighting over the iterations and the epiphanies, and then, jockey for position that way. You could, play Burn Down the Houses in your main deck if you wanted to, because you're worried about the creature deck. So rather than having access to all of your silver bullet cards for the breadth of the format from the get-go by playing this deck that cuts all the dragons and stuff, you could just fit the right things in. But I do think there's something there in just the raw power of taking so many turns in a row and really maximizing Aileron's Epiphany that it can show a lot of like what there is to be explored. I think by the time, maybe a month from now, when the format's had a lot more work put into it.
No, I'm just kidding. Sorry. That's a preview start for the next set.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I know you love to talk about that, Mason.
44 days.
Yeah. So by the time that the format's seen a lot more pressure on it, we can see some of the ideas from there incorporated. Because I did think that the times that iteration came up, it was incredibly impressive. But I think that that's just not every matchup in Standard. The aggressive decks, there's not really opportunities to be using iteration proactively with your other spells, which I feel like
Galvanic Iteration, right? The copy spell.
Yeah, Galvanic Iteration to copy spells. Like maybe in conjunction with Demon Bolt would be really good, actually, because you'd be getting a discount on your removal spell, easier to copy it. There's a lot of room there to explore, but I think that would be more of a pure control shell than a dragon shell, and I fear that the pure control stuff could fit into dragons, but I think that there's definitely something there to work on.
I have such strong opinions about what's being said right now.
Well, so I want to say this real quick, too, before I throw it to you, Spencer. The thing that I really thought of when I saw these decks is like, oh, this is a response to Gregor Klowski. Like these black-green control decks that are like, guess what? My deck is 4 threats that are going to win the game. I don't know if you've heard of her. Her name's Rin 7. And I have 25 lands because she needs them. And then I have 35 removal spells. And that's my deck. Figure it out, idiot. And like that deck is really good at beating the Dragons deck. It just literally has too much cheap removal for like the Dragons to like keep up with in a game where both players' decks are functioning. So I think that this is a response to that sort of deck where it's like, all right, idiot, if you're going to play 35 removal spells, I'm going to play no threats that you ever get to tap out and answer because I'm going to take all the turns. And I think that's that sort of thing. So, Spencer, what do you think about the things that we've said here, since you seem to have such a strong reaction to the blue-red controlling belts? I
think that the Izzet Turns deck, or whatever people are calling it, is like, if Mason's deck is inbred, this one is like I'm just gonna Epiphany, which is fine. Like, that is a way to win games of Magic. But the thing is like, I look at these decks and I think about Cutting Dragons, and I'm like, why am I playing Fading Hope? Like, why am I playing like what is?
Why is everyone diss on Fading Hope all the time?
I love Fading Hope. I just like what are we doing?
I got Fading Hope, your Malevolent Hermit, by the way, when it's flipped, to protect it is hot.
That is great. I'm not saying anything bad about Fading Hope. I'm just saying, like, if we look at the decks that gain percentage, Izzet Turns actually is number 1 on Goldfish. I know that that's like kind of a weird stat. Like, it includes so many decks that like don't matter and stuff. Izzet Turns is actually the deck that gained the most because it didn't exist. Do you know the second deck that gained the most is, Abe? Can you guess?
No.
It is Blue-White Control. Because just the same premise as this happens for Blue-White Control. Where it's like, okay, if I'm cutting Goldspan Dragon, why do I even need red? And I actually really like Mason's idea of like, okay, I want Expressive Iteration. And I don't actually hate the idea of just Jeskai Control turns with like Doomscar and like some of the things you get out of white, because these blue-red decks, while they're deep in very specific mid-range categories because of what red offers, I don't actually know that they're deep enough as like straight control decks. Once somebody figures out how they want to beat this Izzet Turns deck, like with the right threats, you're going to need something to answer those threats. I have a hard time believing that like blue-red straight control is the answer, but I've been wrong a lot of times on this podcast. So
I wonder how much of it could have been that on, because on Magic Online, it's not open deck lists or anything like people might have experienced in the SCGs. How many of the opponents of this Turns deck just thought they were playing against Dragon's opponent?
So many.
Like, I think that it doesn't come up so often anymore, I think, because especially even before COVID, the amount of just open information there was about the decks people were playing, the way it moves through social media is really different. But this definitely feels like a thing where, people were probably like, oh, I've got to have my answers to Goldspan Dragon in the post-board games. And there were just still no dragons to be seen.
It's so crazy, too, because, like, if you lose game 1 to this deck, you're like, man, they had a weird Dragon's draw. Or let's say you beat them, even. Like, you beat them, and then you sideboard wrong. And then, like you just have a bunch of dead cards. It's rough.
I feel like we're really dissing on this deck a lot, and that's because I think it's bad, so I'm gonna keep doing it.
I
also just like cannot be a Malevolent Hermit. It like so like here's the problem. Here's the problem with this deck, and this is the classic Magic player problem. They do this all the time, and they go, "Oh, I'm so smart, I'm so clever. Why do I need to win the game? Winning the game is so pedestrian. Let me turn on my ska and get going. Like, I don't need to win. Like, I can just sit there."
The random jab at your co-host was not necessary, Mason.
Well, I don't know what you're talking about.
You also don't even know what ska is per your own admission.
I said that like 8 hours ago, yeah. I don't know what ska is. I just say I know it's like ska.
Digimon, the movie, listen to the entire soundtrack. Yeah.
That's ska? I didn't know that. I'll have to listen out. Well, anyways, I just think that like losing Goldspan Dragon is a thing you can do. And I think if you truly believe that the black-green or mono-black control decks are the best deck, this is the best blue-red shell we've talked about. Because those decks plans literally are like, hey, idiot, you have like 4 cards that matter. I have 35 that beat them. Figure it out, family style. And the answer is you can't, right? Like, it's just almost impossible. But I just don't believe that not only are we at that point yet, or that people can't figure that out and like hold up a couple of kill spells for your token birds, because you kind of need the birds to hit a couple times.
Fun fact.
And if you don't chain, Meteor Massacre answers all of them for 3 mana. So it's a really, really hard place to be. But then you're also weak against a lot of the cards people already want to bring in. Like, you want to bring in your Malevolent Hermits against like the blue-red dragons deck anyways, and this sort of thing stops that. Same thing with cards like Briarbridge Tracker. Like it's a sort of card that provides a lot of pressure against you. A Seeker's Chariot provides a lot of pressure against you, and if you fall behind, you don't actually have the bodies to stabilize the board, and that's something that happens with Goldspan Dragon. Actually, I don't know how this much happened to you too. I have killed a Chariot and hadn't hold my Goldspan back on D because having a 4/4 body invalidated the board, and they couldn't answer it. And so I think that sort of stuff gets underappreciated by Magic players. And they're like, oh, look how smart, how clever I am. I don't get hit by any of these kill spells. And it's like, well, that's really, really good if you run into these black decks, but they need to be an overwhelming percentage of the metagame. I just don't believe they are. So
this is like such a Zoomer arena problem that I like, where like everybody's like playing their 15 matches on arena in a day and deciding what the format's about on like day 17. Like, it's so funny to me.
I'm curious. You know what I have not done yet? I'm going to look at was there a Moto? There was like a showcase, right? For Standard the day before. If Mono Black was for the top 8 of the showcase, I'll rescind everything I said. I'm checking right now.
It's actually funny, though, you bring that up, because I actually did stop playing the Blue-Red Dragons deck because of these black snow decks, to the point where, like, I switched to Mono White because I was like, well, this 6-mana Wrath is never beating this deck, like, in a million years. And I was right. Yeah. It literally cannot.
For the record, there are no Mono Blacks in the top 8. There are, like, 8 Briarbridge Tracker decks, though. They're just, like, actual 6 Briarbridge Tracker decks in the top 8. Which is funny because there are none, I believe. Well, maybe there's one in the challenge the next day. This shows how things change.
Should we dive in? We kind of got a rapid fire here.
Yeah. Let's hit the key cards there. I think we've talked enough about the spell there. So we've talked about kind of all the creatures over the course of this episode when it comes to these blue-red decks and we should be looking at. But just to kind of hit through these really quick, because I think the spells kind of got underappreciated during our time, so I'd love to spend a little more on that. But Goldspan Dragon is kind of like the blue-red de facto threat. So it ends the game very quickly and gives you a huge mana advantage. That's great. And then things like Malevolent Hermit and either Egg or Moonveil Regent or Imarath, the Desert Doom, or Ilrath, the Desert Doom. Those are kind of the other creatures that are going to be going in your deck. And depending on if you play a Delver variant, you might play something like Castaway or Delver of Secrets. And if you're playing these control variants, you don't have any of that sort of stuff. The spells are kind of the interesting part that we haven't really talked about, because like we've mentioned Expressive Iteration, Alrund's Epiphany, and the various removal spells a good bit, but there are a lot of really strong things going on in the blue-red section with spells, and Divide by Zero is one of the strongest ones. And I mentioned earlier in the podcast how Divide by Zero is like a bad Aether Gust or a bad Remand, but there's a lot of room for that to be good. And Abe, I know that Divide by Zero was a card that you were actually maybe not missed, but didn't include in your first draft, and then once you played with it, you got really big on it. And so I'd love to hear what your thoughts on that are specifically.
Remand is a really messed up Magic card. I think that's like a key here, is that even though we're saying like it's a bad Remand,
like Blue
it's a bounce spell that doesn't bounce. Remand's so good.
It's Blue
and
Rampant
the
Growth, right?
way that the way that the Dragons deck play, and in general just Goldspan Dragon wants you to play, is to get the game to a point where you're going to be able to use your mana advantage to do something powerful. Divide by Zero is a card that purely generates a mana advantage, but also because of the lesson mechanic, the learn mechanic with lessons, it doesn't cost you card economy to be generating that mana advantage. So just like Goldspan Dragon giving you those treasures and, reducing its own cost or allowing you to cast Epiphany is free value on top to this card you already want to play, Divide by Zero is the same thing. And it just plays so well with the way the deck wants to work, because you really are trying to just create a window just long enough for you to go like, okay, now the board's in a place where if I Epiphany and cast a dragon, or cast 2 dragons or 2 Epiphanies or whatever, like when I start going off and doing my thing to get to my late game, this is how it is. And Divide by Zero does so much to slow down the mid-range decks with their Chariots and their Wrens. It can do things like break up Blizzard Brawls. I've done that a good amount on ladder against mono green. And just, or even save your own spells from counter magic. The card's just really versatile, and the learn mechanic plays really well in the deck, because you're able to generate more of a mana advantage trading off with your opponent and time the spell really well to make the battlefield what you need it to be, without making your deck not function by putting a card. Like, if you were to play Unsubstantiated, it would be kind of bad, because sure, it would cost less, but you're going to go down cards to just get a mana advantage. You kind of need it to do both, and this card absolutely does both.
So there are some other spells that are really strong. Like, I think Prismari Command is one that can definitely be looked at in blue-red. Like I said, Answer to Chariot, kill the token and the artifact. How sweet. I'm sure there's some other ones. Spencer, are there any spells that you feel really strong about talking with blue-red before we move on to talking about some of the matchups?
Yeah, obviously we've talked about expressive iteration. You actually just mentioned one of the other ones that I wanted to talk about in Prismari Command. I think that one of the other things that, like, I would want to think about in basically auto-includes somewhere in my 75 are Disdainful Stroke, Burning Hands, and then whether it's... I don't know that I like Crush the Weak as much as I like... is it Cinderclasm?
Cinderclasm?
Yeah, I think that, like, Mono White is actually a little bit better than even I thought, even though, like, I was pretty high on it to start. And I actually do think that there are lots of decks that are struggling with that if they don't have those cards. The other one that I would say is I actually did not even realize the card existed until seeing Abe's deck, but there is a 5-mana sweeper that deals 5.
You didn't know about Burn Down the House?
I did not. And
it's one of my favorite cards in the set.
Oh yeah, I actually think that card's pretty insane in these blue-red decks for multiple reasons. I think it's basically never dead because of the Time Walk, and like also can just blow out. Like, mono green can actually sometimes be a problem for this deck if they like sequence correctly, and it fixes a lot of those problems. So those are kind of the cards I wanted to call out.
For sure. I think Burn Down the House was so good that, like, a Gruul Rampy type deck should maybe be, like, explored, because, like, Burn Down the House, like, being played on turn 4, I think is so effective. And like you said, it's never dead. You have the devils that it makes against control decks, and so it's actually kind of free to be like a big Burn Down the House deck. I don't know if you just get... It might be too small ball compared to the Goldspan Alrund stuff, but it's something that I haven't seen anyone really explore. It seems really potent in the metagame. So
yeah, one of the things that I also thought about, I don't know if I was on the podcast when this card was spoiled, or like if it was just in our text thread, Mason. Mm-hmm. But if you are going to not play the Dragons version, I do really like the enchantment saga that like deals 4 and then whatever. Oh, the other thing that I was going to mention, I just remember this, is I'm not quite sure yet whether I like the draw 2, scry 2 foretell card, or the look at your top X flashback card. Those cards are really close to each other in how you want to build your deck, and it becomes about like, so if I'm playing Egg, I'm just playing the flashback one because it counts mana spent. And I don't know if I'm playing the foretell one the other way, and it's something that's really interesting to me.
Yeah, I think Memory Deluge is one of the really... It's interesting because it's like a really big reason to be a blue deck, right? Like, it is a lot of card selection. It's like a decent enough card in the front half, but in the late game, it gives you that big oomph in card selection. And a lot of times, these blue decks in the late game are looking for very specific cards, because the specific cards will answer the problems at hand. Getting to see 7 cards surprisingly lets you do a good job of finding the thing you're looking for. I do think that one of the problems with Memory Deluge that I mentioned kind of earlier in the podcast when talking about Smoldering Egg is I really didn't like how it forces you into these really awkward situations with your dragon decks, where it's like, I really need to like spend my mana here doing this, but I also am going to fall behind on board, and you're going to fall behind somewhere. You're going to fall behind on mana efficiency or board, and picking the wrong one at the wrong time is sometimes backbreaking, and sometimes there just are no good options. So it is interesting how a card like Behold the Multiverse really does lack that late game pressure, but fixes some of those early problems. I think that is an element of the format that needs to be explored. And Memory Deluge, for the record, and it is one of the good reasons to be the blue-red control deck. Because
for what it's worth, the blue-white deck that I mentioned earlier for like how I would attack blue as a control deck gets to play both. Like, you can just do a 2-2 split and be pretty happy.
Let's move on to matchups. Kind of one of the last things we want to talk about here. And we're going to kind of get a feel for how everyone feels about... Because, I mean, there's a lot of decks we talked about, right? But I think we should specifically kind of look at the blue-red Alrund's Dragon deck, and we should talk from that perspective, because not only is that the most popular, but a lot of matchups are similar, barring the Delver versus like control thing and how they're going to play out a lot of the time. And your answer to that matter. How do we feel the werewolves aggressive deck is versus the Dragons type deck, Abe?
I think that I find that Dragons is pretty favored in the matchup. I think that picking the right creatures out to kill with your removal is pretty important, but in the post-board games where you have, 3 to 4 burning hands, your Dragons, Fires, burn down the house, it's really hard for a deck that's just a pure creature deck to contend. So I think that one goes probably in Dragon's favor.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
I think that like if you whether you have Dragon's Egg or Cinderclasm main deck, and then kind of just like your removal just gets really good, especially if you play that 5/5 dragon, the
Desert Doom.
Is that yeah? I don't remember.
It's Ilrith the Desert Doom.
There we go.
Surname.
I think that like your Dragon's Fires or whatever they're called like become really good in that matchup, and then like Abe said, like post board you just kind of wrap up.
Yes, sir. I feel a similar way about green, but I think it's a little harder against green because their bodies are a little bigger on average, so your removal has to line up a little better, but also Snakeskin Veil post board lets them do a pretty good job of not only outclassing your removal, like a lot of times Old Growth Troll goes from 4 to 5, which becomes the real problem, or a big problem, I should say, but also just the mana efficiency of them able to answer your spells with that little spell is, I think, pretty big, but I still feel like it's a close matchup.
I actually agree
Ranger class, I think also is a huge issue for the blue-red decks, because the second mode, not only do they get to play kind of more at their speed, it puts them in the driver's seat as far as deciding how they're spending their mana, but giving a body that has to die because if they get 2 triggers off of like putting a counter on when it attacks, like it's out of most of your removals range, but following that up with every creature becomes that way is a huge problem.
Yeah, I think that like the Gruul Werewolves deck specifically, like I think the reason that it saw such a uptick in popularity, like we saw Paulo play it on a YouTube video, like we saw obviously it had that success week 1. And that matchup is more about sequencing and understanding your role as the blue-red Dragons deck. Whereas I think what you said, Mason, is true about the mono-green matchup, where like it is actually how my hand aligns against your hand, which I'm not always in control of, and so then it becomes a lot harder.
That's the thing. I think that's a good way to put it. Let's talk about the black-green or black X control decks or mono black. We kind of mentioned it earlier. This is like the reason, right, to play the control version of the blue-red deck, is because these matchups I think are very, very hard. They come in there with a boatload of removal spells. Even their threats to take over the game have reach, whether it's Lolith the Spider Queen or if it's Ren 7 in the green versions, and those sort of things make it really hard for them to win. Does anyone feel it's different? I feel like this is sort of like, if you sign for blue-red Dragons, this is the one deck you really would like to not play against more than once a tournament.
I have personally had very different experiences, but I agree that, like,
theoretically,
if they build their deck to have all of the cheap removal, it becomes really difficult for Dragons. I think the times I've played against it, I've gotten a little lucky sometimes where my opponent has maybe not understood how dangerous the situation was for them. They tapped down low and didn't have any mana to like cast removal spells for my Dragons, or weren't ready for me to take 2 turns when I had a couple of Foretold cards with Epiphany. But I think it's close. I think there's I think it might be a little closer than we've made it sound, but it definitely is not one I'm excited about. Binding the Old Gods is a very, very clean answer to a lot of what's going on in the Dragons deck, and just eventually getting to Blood on the Snow, back Lolth is such a powerful endgame.
It's interesting. The black-white version has actually been more successful against me as the Dragons deck. I don't know if it's how I'm sequencing, but like Spider Queen into the 4/4 make 2 angels card, like has actually been kind of hard to beat. And it could be that it's because I'm I'm shorter on Disdainful Strokes than I think that you two seem to be, which actually could probably fix a lot of issues in the format for me. But I've actually found the black-white deck to be pretty challenging for the Dragons deck.
Yeah, I think usually my Hermits and like being really patient. I also play a ton of Saw It Comings and like I'm very high on counter magic in my list, kind of incognizant, like because I expected this deck to be doing pretty well at the time when I was playing, but yeah, like I think it can go either way. It's kind of like the place where I think that dragons might be like one of the best decks in the format is because of the fact that there's so much room to adjust kind of the way these matchups can play out with the cards you choose.
Yep. I agree with that a lot. I think, like you mentioned today, the blue-red card pool is super deep and underexplored still, like I mentioned a bunch of times. Let's talk for a second about the white decks, and we can talk about the green-white kind of prowessy type decks, Magecraft, that Aaron Barish has popularized over the weekend along with mono white. I think this is another really bad matchup. I think where mono black is like, I'm going to answer all your stuff and you're going to have a really hard time winning as like their main game plan, this not lining up so well with your game plan. The mono white game plan of I'm going to quickly and efficiently get underneath you and pressure you is really troublesome for some blue red decks if you don't have your deck built the right way, where you don't sequence your cards correctly. Spencer, how do you feel? Because I know you've been playing a lot of mono white, and I think that cards like Divide by Zero, the more those tick up in the blue red decks, the worse you get against mono white.
Dude,
So,
it's actually kind of funny because when we did our set review for whatever Paladin class is in, so I assume that's Forgotten Realms. Like, we're doing this set review on Mythic Cast, and I was like, there's just literally in our set review a mono white aggro deck. Like, that just exists. And I actually think that Paladin class specifically is really, really good against the black decks and the blue red decks. It's like to an inappropriate amount where like the card looked kind of mopey last season and now looks really powerful. The thing is so I actually had not heard of this green white Aaron Barrich deck until literally this second. So I don't know if that deck's playing that card, but for like the mono white versions, the reasons that you can beat out the blue red decks is because you get to use your mana every turn and not use your cards every turn. So whether it's Paladin class, whether it's activating your 1-drop that makes the 1/1, you just get to use your mana all the time. You have tons of man lands. I actually took your guys' advice after the last episode, went straight up to 8 man lands. It was great. Like, you guys were just right. It was insane. It is a bad matchup for blue red dragons. And in all honesty, I don't really know how you would fix it other than like more cheap wraths, like more Cinder, whatever, like Cold the Week or whatever it's called. I don't know that you need to fix it though. Like, that deck has other problems, and it just, people are playing it because they're expecting the fact that there's 7 different blue red decks. But yeah.
yeah, I think it all depends on what you think you'll be playing a lot of, and maybe if mono white is the deck to play, maybe you should be moving away from blue red. If you think it really is going to be like a huge force in the metagame, or like the de facto best deck.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The common thread I think that I've mentioned about blue red is just mana and how good it is at spending its mana and gaining a mana advantage and leveraging it, and you just can't do that against mono white. Their cards are all cheaper than yours.
Stock coming looks ridiculous. Like, absolutely ridiculous against mono white. You're like, all right, well, I have 2 stock comings in my hand. Like, I'm going to lose this game.
Yeah, all their cards are way cheaper than yours. They all need to die because they have so many ways to invest in them. And like, a lot of their cards compound on that by additionally taxing mana. Paladin class's static ability of making spells more expensive on your turn is huge against blue red. The amount of times I'm not able to cast like multiple removal spells or not be able to save my removal spell for maybe them casting Homestead Courage or something. Really problematic. Elite Spellbinder, obviously very good against, like, if you catch an Alrund's Piff in my hand, I'm never going to cast that. That's 9 mana. It's just not happening. So, I think it's like probably the easiest, like, if you wanted to be blue-red, the easiest way to do it would be to play mono red.
Let's talk about Jund/Gruul real quick. We've mentioned these deck a bunch with like a Secret Chariot Ren 7s, and I think the kind of key to this matchup really is just like, we are more mana efficient a lot of the times, and things like Disdainful Stroke give you these huge swing turns against them. In the same way with like things like Prismari Command, these Dragonfires answering their spells. And I think that sort of stuff is a real problem for these decks, and Alaron goes over the top of those. And I think a very similar way it does with the festival decks that are specifically green-white based. I think all three of these decks kind of have a problem with, and the reason this deck is good for what it's worth is that, like, hey, I'm going to answer the few things that actually stop me from getting across the line with my Goldspan Dragon. I'm going to cast these Alaron Epiphanies and just go over the top, and your game plan is actually too small ball for me, and just cannot interact with what I'm doing. Do y'all feel like that's a fair analysis of the Jund Gruul / green-white festival decks?
I actually do. I think that if I were to lump in those matchups together, I would actually lump those two decks together for one specific reason. You need early interaction for their mana creatures, whether that's the Dwarf and the Sentinel, or whether that's the Lotus Cobra or whatever. I think that a combination of Prismari Command and other cheap removal spells, and then making sure that you're not going to lose to the token of Wrenn and 7 is basically what the entire matchup is about against both of these decks.
Yeah, all the Wrenn Chariot mid-range decks are really fighting their own kind of game about getting the most 2/2s and powers on the ground, and Dragon literally flying over all of that, along with Epiphany, is like, it kind of makes them all play about the same thing. So they're all relying on Wrenn and 7 to solve their dragon problem.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that basically covers. We're seeing the Bant Festival decks, kind of like I talked about last week, starting to pop up a little bit, but it's unclear if that sort of thing is going to stick around. But the Dragons deck is very good. Like, we just talked about a bunch of different matchups in the format. We obviously didn't cover everything that's really going on, but we're talking about a lot of the big players. You have a lot of really favorable matchups. And I think the thing that this deck really has, I really want to sell on the listeners on before going forward, is the Goldspan Dragon Alaron's Epiphany package, like that plus something else to like kind of hit them, allows you to have not only these mana efficient games and these ability to go over top of games, but allows you to steal games. Even in your bad matchup, like Abe talked about the black deck, if you just like answer the spell they go for, or maybe on the wrong turn, or they kind of have to, it's just the way their hand's crafted, and you just go like Goldspan Alarons and just take a couple turns and chunk them down a bunch of life, it can be very, very hard for those players to ever actually catch up. And you can also do things like running Goldspan Dragons off the top. Just a 4/4 haste flying is actually very hard to answer for a lot of decks. And you have to be really dedicated. We have to make the game not about that in the way we saw Mono White. But if Mono White gets got by a Cinderclasm and you able to bridge that late game, they can have some real problems actually killing you before you killed them with something like Goldspan Dragon. So I think there's a lot of real oomph to this deck. And if you're looking for something that's kind of a safe thing to buy into with money or with your wild cards, there's a lot of different ways you can play these blue-red decks and a lot of different places to explore with them. So I think that's a really powerful, and that's kind of why we talked about blue-red today. Not only is it great to kind of give you a view of what's going on in the format, but also it's so, powerful and diverse that hopefully this was helpful for y'all along those lines. Let's move into kind of the wrap-up portion of the show. But before we wrap it up, we've decided to sell out. Are y'all excited? We're going to do the hashtag MTGtober on Twitter, and we're going to all three do it. And we'd all decide this before the podcast. It doesn't really matter, but we're putting it on the podcast. We've now forced ourselves dedicated to do it. Where every day on our Twitters, which you can follow us at Spencer13H, at More No Things, and at Mason E. Clark, there's like the Magic Twitter thing's doing this thing where you draw one of these like things from Innistrad every day. And so day 1, October 1st, this Friday, baby, Fungus, get excited. It's going to be there. It's going to be awesome. Now we're all committed because we've done this. And now we get to go to the actual wrap-up portion of the show where I can say, hey, if you want to support us, go to patreon.com/CCMTG. Becoming a patron of the show, you get a lot of benefits. You get to see deck lists. You get to talk to us directly on the Discord. And you get to ask questions on the show, like the Patreon question. We didn't have one for this week, so instead I'm going to ask everyone their favorite candy since we're getting so close to Halloween. I'm going to start with Spencer. Spencer, go. Favorite candy?
Oh, man. You've actually asked me this question on the show before, Mason Clark.
Yeah, that's every Halloween. I don't know.
Twix is the best candy that there is. I have actually done extensive research on this. Everybody has Twix in their top 5 candy bars. Twix is non-controversial, the best candy because everyone likes it and nobody hates it.
Abe, favorite candy?
Pink Starburst.
Dude, Starburst?
Yellow Starburst.
Have you ever roasted a Starburst, Abe?
Ever roasted a Starburst?
Wait, have you not?
Why would I mess with perfection?
Oh, say, hold on.
I've never heard of roasting
your
a
life
Starburst.
is about to change.
No, it's not. I
It really
refuse.
is. I literally over your
blasphemy.
oven. No, your life is about to change. Starburst,
No.
already
I'm
one
going
of the
to
best
Twitter.
candy
I'm
of all
tweeting.
time. Already one of the
I
best candy of all time.
refuse.
No,
I
dude.
refuse to be shown the light. If this is the cave, if this is you showing me the Matrix, I'm taking that pill that lets me go back to where I live. I don't want to hear about it.
Dude, you're missing out.
He's blue pilled.
That's fine. I'm looking at the shadows on the wall of the cave, and I like them.
Oh man, it's too bad, man. You've experienced less of life than you could have otherwise.
I'll probably have to do it at some point. It's on the list with peanut butter and pickles that I've been told.
Oh
to
no,
try
I'm
to.
not ever doing that.
So I'll do peanut butter and pickles first. Palate cleanser with the roasted Starburst because I trust you more than the person who told me to eat peanut butter and pickles.
Roasted Starburst. Next time you go to a campfire, just bring a bag of Starburst, put those on the stick instead of marshmallows. You literally will be like, what have I done my whole life with Starburst that wasn't this? You get that
Officer,
crunchy
that's him.
outside.
Arrest him.
I don't know that guy.
I have never heard of
Mason, what's your favorite candy?
Starburst. I'm sorry, I'm having trauma right now for this roasted Starburst.
I
Reese's Pieces.
promise you it's life-changing.
You know what? It might actually be the York Mint or the Junior Mint. I like the York and Junior Mint a lot, but here's the problem with the York and the Junior Mint is if you have more than two, your tummy starts to hurt a little bit.
How do you
Just
look
like
24 but sound 78? I don't understand.
My mom loves York peppermint patties. I also like them a lot, but they're not my favorite.
By the way, the Twitter poll, all my interaction is no so far on Happy Roasted the Starburst. If you follow me on Twitter, you'll understand why I tweeted this at this time. You know when we record as well. Yeah, it's got to be the classic Reese's. Just like
That's a good
although
one.
not like the cup, like the big one, but the small little gold ones. You know what I mean?
believe
They're like
I believe that
little
it's
crowns.
Ones you only really see on
It's a good
Halloween.
one. You know what's funny?
Yeah.
Do Reese's eggs taste substantially different than the?
They taste better.
Oh, they're way better. Also, I read an article on this. It is actually because of the peanut butter to chocolate portions that are on the egg versus the regular Reese's cup, and also it is why the small cups taste so much different than the regular cups.
Did you ask me a leading Reese's question?
I sure did.
I would like to also point out that I DM'd a friend who had messaged me during the show who I was going to respond to. I said, I'll respond to you in a minute, but I need to know, have you ever roasted a Starburst? They said, roasted? No, what? We're not friends anymore.
Anyway, Mason's got to salvage his relationship with
It's
people.
true.
I'm doing coverage.
You
I'm doing
can
damage
check out
control.
while Mason's recovering. You can check out the rest of the Constructive Criticism Network over at constructivecriticism.com. We got Sam Black with Drafting Archetypes. We got Adam Spain with Homeward Path. We've got the guys Christian and Brad with the #1 podcast in Popper in Common Knowledge. And then you can check out this podcast every week over at constructivecriticism.com.
That's 100% correct. Thank you all so much for listening. Next week, we're going to try and rope Spencer into maybe the return of Modern on the podcast. A little MH2 block constructed. Spencer, I'm going to ask you the Ship of Theseus question. How much do we change Modern before it's not Modern? That is where we're heading into next week, maybe. We haven't actually decided. This is me.
I don't know what that means. You're pitching an episode.
Do you know? Have you ever heard the Ship of Theseus?
The
Ship of Theseus is
high
this.
school.
Okay, so basically, for listeners too who didn't watch WandaVision, because by the way, this was a thing before WandaVision, and then WandaVision happened, and everyone mentions the Ship of Theseus now. Like, of course, I knew that before. I just didn't mention it before WandaVision.
Here's the thing. I can play Modern. I need to download MTG on my computer, but we can modern it up.
Modern, Ragavan.
The thing is I'm just gonna play Blue Red. Like, it looks like the best deck by so much.
Well, that's what
Did you say
Hammer
wrong?
Time.
Did you say wrong?
No,
I said
bonk.
bonk.
Oh, bonk.
Bonk is equivalent to wrong, though, is what he's implying.
Oh.
He's gonna hit you with a hammer.
Oh, yeah, I have heard a good thing. This format looks so different. I was actually texting Mason about this. We can exit after this, but like I was texting Mason. I think it was Mason about this. I was like, I looked at the top 8 Modern decks and like, what is happening?
The Modern Horizons has Ship of Theseus the format. It's just a different format than you played.
I was expecting to see like Amulet Titan. The only deck that is in the top 8 decks is like Blue-White Control. Like, that's the only one left. And that deck was like maybe, a little overrated before.
Well, now it's like a Chalice of the Void deck. So it's like, what even is going on?
What even is Magic? Thank you guys for listening.
we'll see y'all next week for another episode of Constructive Criticism.
I'm supposed to say something quippy at the end because somebody mentioned that they really liked the fact that I dunked on Abe's card at the end of the set review episode. But all I can think is the fact...
Oh, I think they'll get plenty out of the Starburst. Don't worry.